Nobody on television is saying this clearly enough, so I will say it plainly, the way you would say it to a friend sitting across from you at the kitchen table. 3 weeks ago, the world changed. Not in a Hollywood, dramatic, end of days kind of way. The change showed up in your grocery bill, in your gas tank, in your retirement account, in the value of every dollar you have worked a lifetime to save. And if nobody has walked you through what is actually happening right now, what it means for your money, and what you can do about it, that is exactly what we are doing today. My name is Professor Jiang. Geopolitics is what I teach. And today's lesson is the one that matters most, because this time, the classroom is your savings, your household, your future. So let's get into it. On February 28th, 2026, the United States and Israel launched coordinated airstrikes against Iran, opening with what military planners call a decapitation strike, targeting Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. Within days, Iran fired back, and the Middle East went from tense and fragile to a war zone. Now you might be thinking, wars happen. Why should this one touch my retirement account? Here is the answer, and it comes down to one small body of water. The Strait of Hormuz sits 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, narrow enough that people can swim across it. Before this war started, roughly 20 million barrels of oil moved through that strait every single day. Japan gets 75% of its oil through there. India pulls 60% through it. China depends on it for 40%. The entire energy backbone of the modern world passes through a passage barely wider than some American counties, and Iran has now effectively closed it. The moment that strait closed, a global economic countdown began. Factories cannot run, homes cannot be heated, airplanes cannot fly, and hospitals cannot operate without energy. And when energy becomes scarce, everything becomes more expensive. That is not drama. That is just how supply and demand works. Before the war, Brent crude oil sat at around $65 a barrel, which is a reasonable number for a world that, while imperfect, was still functioning. 3 weeks after the first airstrikes, Brent crude had surged past $100, a 40% jump in less than a month. The Council on Foreign Relations ran the numbers and concluded that a prolonged closure of the strait could push oil toward $170 a barrel. And Goldman Sachs warned it could hit $150 by the end of March if the strait stays closed. What that number means at your gas station is this. Nationwide, unleaded gas has already climbed from $2.98 a gallon on February 26th to $3.93, a 24% surge in 3 weeks. And here's what that surge actually touches. Every delivery truck costs more to operate. Every airplane burns more expensive fuel. Every product shipped from a warehouse to your grocery store carries a higher freight cost, and none of that extra expense disappears. It gets passed straight to you. Then Qatar Energy entered the picture. On March 2nd, the company suspended LNG production after an Iranian drone attack, and Qatar supplies 20% of the world's liquefied natural gas. That supply went from flowing to stopped almost overnight, and European gas benchmarks responded by nearly doubling. The IMF's managing director, Kristalina Georgieva, warned on March 9th that a prolonged war poses an inflationary risk to the entire global economy. This is not commentary from fringe analysts. These are the people who manage the world's financial architecture, and they are worried. There is a word that economists have started whispering. They are not shouting it yet, but the whisper is getting louder. That word is stagflation. Older Americans watching this already know what that word tastes like. The gas lines of the 1970s, the grocery sticker shock, the interest rates that made buying a home feel unreachable. Stagflation is that specific, brutal combination of high inflation and a slowing economy arriving at the same time, and it is the hardest scenario for policymakers to manage because there is no clean solution. Raise interest rates to fight inflation, and you crush economic growth. Lower rates to help the economy, and you let inflation run. Every option carries a cost. The 1979 to 1980 period which also involved Iran and an oil shock, produced treasury yields that surged to around 15%, oil prices that more than doubled and stayed elevated for years, and gold that shot to nearly $800 to $850 an ounce. The S&P 500 delivered weak real returns as stagflation and recession battered American equities for years. That is the historical comparison analysts are reaching for right now. Before this war started, the Federal Reserve's preferred inflation measure was already stuck at about 3%, above its 2% target, which meant the Fed had no breathing room. Now, if oil prices hold at around $100 a barrel, headline inflation could run 1.25 percentage points higher than it otherwise would have been. Frederick Schneider at the Middle East Council on Global Affairs put it directly: markets are underestimating the risk of a prolonged war. If the war continues for another month and energy prices rise sharply, the consequences for the global economy could become severe. Alex Jacques, a former economic advisor to the White House, added that markets are really underpricing the tail risk of a sustained engagement. The energy story is the obvious one, but two other shocks are developing in parallel and getting almost no coverage, and both of them are serious. The first involves helium, and before you dismiss that as a birthday balloon problem, stay with me. Qatar operates one of the world's largest helium production hubs, a facility called Ras Laffan, and Iranian attacks on it have taken roughly 1/3 of global helium supply off the market. Helium is not optional in modern manufacturing. Semiconductor production requires it. MRI machines depend on it. And without a steady helium supply, the factories that make computer chips cannot operate. No chips means the modern economy starts grinding. The second shock is fertilizer. And this one carries implications that will take longer to show up, but could be more damaging over time. The Gulf region serves as a major artery for fertilizer inputs like urea, ammonia, and sulfur, the building blocks of synthetic fertilizer that modern agriculture runs on. Disruption there means farming output drops, and when farming output drops, food prices climb. Now, stack those three together: expensive energy, disrupted helium supply, tightening fertilizer inputs. Three pillars of modern life being squeezed at the same time, and most Americans have no idea the second and third shocks even exist. And for those thinking American oil production makes the U.S. immune to all of this, the numbers say otherwise. The U.S. produces about as much oil as it consumes in total, but most American households are oil consumers, not oil producers. Americans consume more energy per day on average than Europeans or residents of China, which means higher oil prices hit American families directly, whatever the production statistics say. More than half of all American adults own stocks, most of them through retirement accounts and mutual funds, which means the market's behavior over the past 4 weeks has been personal for a lot of people. The S&P 500 and NASDAQ just posted their worst 4-week period since April of last year, and those numbers are not abstract. When the market falls, that is your future moving in the wrong direction. Since the war began, 10-year Treasury bond yields climbed roughly 30 basis points to 4.25%. And what that means in practical terms is that mortgages got more expensive, auto loans got more expensive, and business borrowing got more expensive at exactly the moment when the economy needed relief rather than additional pressure. The Federal Reserve had been expected to cut rates this year, but markets are now pricing in 0 cuts for 2026, with the first possible cut pushed to the third quarter at the earliest. Consumer sentiment has already hit its lowest reading of the year, according to the University of Michigan survey, and JP Morgan Global Research estimates that if oil prices stay elevated, global GDP growth for the first half of 2026 could be depressed by 0.6% at an annual rate. None of this is projection anymore. The economic damage is already accumulating. Gold spent 25 on a historic run, gaining 64% over the year and crossing $5,000 an ounce for the first time in January. Silver climbed 135% over the same period. So when a shooting war started in the Middle East, every instinct said gold would surge immediately, because that is the conventional playbook. Crisis arrives, gold rises. But here is what actually happened. Gold did tick up briefly when the strikes landed on February 28th, moving from $5,296 to $5,423 an ounce, and then it sold off hard, dropping more than 6% in days and continuing to fall after that. Since the war began, gold has lost more than 14% of its value and posted its biggest weekly loss since 1983. That is not a small correction, that is a reversal. The explanation sits in interest rates. An oil shock of this magnitude pushes central banks to hold rates steady or consider raising them, and gold pays no interest. When treasury bonds and high-yield savings accounts are actually generating income, gold loses some of its relative appeal. Adding to the pressure, the dollar index climbed nearly 2% since the war began, and a stronger dollar makes gold more expensive for international buyers, which dampens demand further. What none of that changes is the long-term picture. Before the war, JP Morgan set a year-end 2026 price target of $6,300 an ounce for gold. Bank of America put its target at $6,000. BNP Paribas raised its 2026 average forecast by 27%, and Wells Fargo placed its range at $6,100 to $6,300 for year-end. The World Gold Council recommends a 5 to 10% portfolio allocation under normal conditions, with financial advisors typically moving that recommendation toward 10 to 20% during elevated geopolitical risk. Across 10 major conflict events since 1970, gold has historically rallied 5 to 15% in the initial months of a conflict once the shock stabilizes. The lesson is not that gold is broken. The lesson is that gold is broken. That the peak of a crisis tends to produce disappointment, while patient, measured accumulation over time tends to produce results. Keep that distinction clear. Stop for a moment and answer this honestly. If your income stopped completely tomorrow and stopped for 6 months, what would happen to your household? For a lot of Americans, that answer is uncomfortable. Mark Hamrick, senior economic analyst at Bankrate, names adequate liquidity, meaning cash you can actually reach, as the foundation of financial resilience against rising prices. Financial planner Lazetta Rainey Braxton calls it a cushion account and describes it as a critical safeguard to help you navigate inflation, job transitions, and unexpected opportunities. Your cash cushion is not lazy money sitting around doing nothing. In a period of genuine economic disruption, it is the thing that keeps you from making panic, destructive decisions with your long-term savings. 3 to 6 months of living expenses in accessible cash comes before any investment adjustment, before any strategy shift, before anything else. Build the cushion first. A lot of people build a cash cushion and then park everything in a checking account, paying essentially nothing while inflation eats it. Blair Duchesnay, a certified financial planner and chartered financial analyst at Ritholtz Wealth Management and a member of the CNBC Financial Advisor Council, offers a cleaner framework. Divide your cash by time horizon. Money needed within the next 30 days belongs in a checking account where it can be reached instantly. Money you will not need for 30 days to 6 months belongs in a high-yield savings account, which is paying meaningful interest right now compared to traditional savings. Money you will not need for 6 months, up to 2 years, belongs in U.S. Treasury bills or short-term Treasury ETFs that mature in the 0 to 3 month range. With 10-year Treasury yields having risen since the war began, short-term government bills are paying real money to hold your cash safely while you wait out the uncertainty. That is not hiding money. That is deploying it strategically. Watching your retirement account fall triggers every human instinct to move, to act, to get the money out of harm's way. That instinct, in most cases, will cost you money. When you sell into a panic, you lock in losses that might otherwise be temporary, turning a paper decline into a permanent one. And then you miss the recovery because timing the market back in is nearly impossible. TIAA Wealth Management CEO David Nason wrote that the clients that are best positioned to weather this uncertainty are those who planned for it before it happened. Justin Smith, a certified financial planner with Savant Wealth Management in Phoenix, said directly, "It's always important to stick with your plan, and times of stress are not the best times to be taking rush actions." History shows that equity markets often rebound when military conflicts end, and the investors who panic sell during the crisis are typically the ones who miss that rebound, selling near the bottom and buying back in near the top. Strategic, calm rebalancing is different from fear-driven selling. One of those produces better outcomes than the other. Treasury inflation-protected securities, known as TIPS, are U.S. government bonds with one property that makes them relevant right now. Their principal, the face value of the bond, rises with inflation. As prices climb, the bond becomes more valuable, which means your purchasing power gets protected rather than eroded. With inflation running at 3% and potentially climbing, with energy prices spiking, and with the Federal Reserve unable to raise rates aggressively without damaging an already slowing economy, TIPS are one of the few instruments designed specifically for this kind of environment. Front-dated TIPS are currently trading at negative real yields out to October 2026, which means professional investors managing enormous sums of money are accepting lower returns in exchange for guaranteed inflation protection. And they are doing it because they expect energy shocks to keep inflation elevated into the summer of 2026. When that kind of money is that serious about inflation protection, it deserves attention. TIPS can be purchased directly through treasurydirect.gov or through any standard brokerage account. After everything covered in the goals section above, the practical guidance comes down to this: measured allocation, patient accumulation, and no panic buying at crisis peaks. Dollar cost averaging into gold positions, meaning buying small regular amounts over time rather than one large purchase during a crisis, consistently produces better long-term results than trying to time a single entry point. The World Gold Council's recommendation of 5 to 10% for long-term portfolios under normal conditions moves toward 10 to 20% during periods of elevated geopolitical risk. For older Americans specifically, think of gold as insurance. You do not buy insurance expecting to use it. You buy it because if things go seriously wrong, you want protection in place. A 10% allocation is not a declaration that civilization is ending. It is a reasonable acknowledgement that the world is uncertain, which it demonstrably is right now. Not all corners of the stock market behave the same way when energy prices surge and the economy slows. Morgan Stanley's analysts have suggested rotating into industrials and materials for this kind of environment, maintaining positions in diversifiers like gold and real estate investment trusts, and adding selectively to high-quality, large-cap stocks in healthcare, which tends to hold up in economic downturns because people continue needing medical care regardless of what oil costs. Energy-related holdings have appreciated sharply since the war began, which is exactly what you would expect when oil prices climb 40% in 3 weeks. The broader principle is that assets behaving differently from domestic large-cap growth stocks provide a buffer when growth stocks are under pressure. International equities, real assets, dividend-paying, defensive names. None of them soar in a bull market, but none of them collapse the way concentrated growth positions can when rates stay high and growth slows simultaneously. For anyone at or near retirement, this defensive thinking is not optional caution. It is the appropriate posture for someone who does not have 20 years to wait for a recovery. RSM chief economist Joe Brusuelas described the situation as a potential short-term affordability shock that will restrain consumption and growth across the economy. Higher long-term interest rates from this conflict will push up mortgage rates and auto loan rates at exactly the wrong time, adding borrowing costs to households already absorbing higher energy and food prices. Variable rate debt, including credit card balances and adjustable rate mortgages, becomes a trap when rates stay elevated, and paying that debt down aggressively now protects you from watching the interest payments grow. Your energy-related household expenses, electricity, heating, gas, need to be budgeted at higher levels than last year, not last year's numbers. With fertilizer supply chains disrupted and energy costs elevated, food prices are likely to climb, and building a modest buffer of shelf-stable staples at today's prices is prudent household management, not anything more dramatic than that. Our grandparents understood this kind of preparation instinctively. Review your fixed monthly expenses and identify anything you're paying for that you have not examined in a year. Subscriptions, insurance rates, services that quietly renew. In a period of financial pressure, every dollar you recover and redirect is doing useful work. And beyond the financial preparation, think practically about your household, medications you need regularly, plans for if energy becomes expensive or intermittently scarce. Preparation is not fear, it is the opposite of fear. It is what informed people do when they understand the situation clearly. 3 weeks into this conflict, oil prices have risen more than 40%. Gas at the pump has climbed nearly 25%. The stock market posted its worst 4-week stretch in over a year. Consumer confidence fell to its lowest point of the year, and the Federal Reserve finds itself unable to cut rates into a slowing economy. Hidden shocks in helium and fertilizer are developing behind the energy headlines. Capital Economics has noted that if this conflict ends quickly, the global economic damage will remain limited, painful, but manageable. History supports the idea that markets recover when crises resolve because they consistently have, but here is what does not happen